Hello, everyone, and welcome to our strategic conversation today with Parag Khanna. Parag, thank you for joining us from Singapore. Parag, you need no introduction to this global audience. So we all know you, we've heard you, we've seen you on television, we've read your books. And your book, The Future is Asian, which is your latest book, is of course a must read for anyone who wants to understand what's happening today in Asia, but also the past and the future. So we're really, really pleased to have you here with us. You're also a leading global strategy advisor, and you have your own firm called Future Map. So friends, if you've been following our strategic conversations for these months that we've been in lockdown, you know that we live in a very troubled world. COVID-19 has impacted very strongly on our societies, on our economies, but also on global geopolitics. But now, as we cautiously, carefully, step by step come out of the lockdowns across the world, some more quickly than others, we have to start thinking of what happens next. And there, of course, we all know that this recovery will have to be a global effort. We'll all have to work together. And that means Europe and Asia will have to work together. Today is a very special day for Friends of Europe because we're devoting all morning session to our relationship between Europe and Asia and looking at how we're going to be working together, not just in the search for a new vaccine, but also a global effort at recovery, at helping those who have been worst hit by the crisis. But as we start this conversation, I'm really happy that Parag, you are here. And my question to you, my first question would be, here in Europe, we're talking a lot about the Asian century, but some people, and quite a few people, are saying, hey, wait a minute, this is not an Asian century, this is actually a China century. So let's have your comments on that, please.
Sure. It's great to be with you, Shada. Thanks so much for including me. And I suppose this is the closest we can get to that in-person conversation that we had planned, but in due course, we'll get to do that as well. Look, one of the primary reasons why I wrote the book is precisely to point out that it is an Asian story and that China is an integral part of that story, but it is not the sum total of that story. You have an Asia without China. You have a China without the rest of Asia, but it's the two together that have actually led to this dramatic transformation in the global power balance that we feel today. And the story really begins with Japan in the post-war decades. It was Japan that inspired the tiger economies, Japan and the tiger economies that inspired China, and now Japan, the tiger economies, and China that are collectively leading the investments into the fourth wave of Asian growth economies, South and Southeast Asia. You have a collective story of 4.5 billion people. And so I think that, I won't dwell on this too much in this conversation, but I've gone to great lengths to point out that people who simply want to identify one nation at any given time as the locus of power in the global system really don't understand the history or global history, as it were, which is much more about broader regional sweeps rather than singular powers. And we should never fall victim to a very, very parsimonious theoretical approach that doesn't really have sufficient grounding in reality.
Thank you very much for Parag. I think that's absolutely important now to correct that impression, and you've done it brilliantly as well. And let's turn to Asia today and how the COVID-19 is impacting on Asian societies, on Asian economies. Asia's coming out of it. Asia was struck first by the pandemic. How is Asia being transformed? What are the trends you're seeing in this changing world?
Well, probably the most significant impact globally of COVID on economics, potentially even geopolitics, was underway before the pandemic, and that was regionalism. Right? It was before the pandemic that you had the US-China trade war and the attempts at decoupling. Suddenly, North American trade was greater internally than with the rest of the world. European trade has in any case for decades been largely internal. And in Asia, you have found that Asians trade more with each other than the rest of the world. It was before the pandemic that Asian countries passed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, to further integrate their trade. So regionalism, which of course, again, builds on the first point we were discussing, is going to continue, because just imagine, how long is it going to be before people will regularly take, in large volumes, transcontinental flights? It will be a long time. Our reopening is going to be incremental and regional. right? Within Asia, within Europe, within North America. That's just going to reinforce what was happening already. So Asians are also learning from each other. This embrace of technology in Asia, as we've seen with the contact tracing apps, is going to internationalize as countries learn from each other how to conform to each other's requirements around geolocation and medical reporting and that kind of thing. As you see, Asians do not have any inhibitions about embracing these technologies and deploying them. That's going to be very helpful for Asia and its recovery.
So Parag, when we were speaking a few days earlier, you talked to me about how we're moving towards a 3-speed world. And I was wondering if you could be elaborate a bit about this 3-speed world rather than just 2-speed world.
Mm-hmm. We used to think about the world as 2-speed emerging economies and developed markets, but now I would say it's a North America, Europe, Asia kind of a trifurcation. And, clearly the stimulus policies that have been undertaken are largely meant to benefit, of course, the domestic consumption market in each country. There's some spillover effects, the nearshoring of supply chains that's also going to re-regionalize. This is something that Europe now is also trying to do quite strongly. It also obviously echoes to some degree what the Trump administration is trying to do. Whereas, of course, in Asia, most of the supply chains already are national or regional. And you'll see some shifts as countries move supply chains out of China into Southeast Asia. But again, that just deepens regionalism. So, Asia will be the only region of the world this year that will record any growth whatsoever. Some countries within Asia, of course, some of the emerging markets will have significant economic corrections. China may have slightly positive growth, but on the whole, to the extent that there is a recovery at all, it's not a global one. It's very much an Asian one. And it's a race to recover in many ways, given this kind of 3-pole, 3-pillar kind of system that we have. So again, the facts are that Asia is going to come out of this, faster than other regions of the world. And again, it has the demographic foundations, the consumption markets, the recovery of mobility for the consumer and travel sector and so forth. The industry is here, finance is here, and some of the monetary policies that are necessary to ensure flexibility are also there. So I think Asia has things aligned pretty well.
And do you see any potential for actually dialogue, consultation, even cooperation between these 3, as you've said, 3 poles in a sense, 3 regions, 3 different systems coming together? Do you see any chances of collaboration? Because at the moment, Parag, things are not looking good.
No, and I think that, we should not hold relations across the major centers of gravity in the world hostage to a single issue. Historically, that's the recipe for disaster. It's not that there cannot be tension, it's that one issue, whether it is military or economic or cultural or whatever the case may be, cannot hold hostage, these relationships. That's critical. And here I would say again, I've always emphasized that in this multipolar framework, we should not treat the West as a coherent, unified bloc. And this goes back more than 15 years, really. If you think about some of the divergence in transatlantic relations, it dates back to the post 9/11 geopolitical interventions of the United States. So we're talking about 20 years now where Europe has genuinely been trying and struggling and succeeding in many ways to find its own voice in economic issues. So let's take, why does this matter? Well, if you look at Europe's strategy towards Asia, on the one hand, yes, it is talking tougher on China. It has a strategic industrial policy that's more coherent now. It is doing investment screening. But at the same time, last year, it passed a free trade agreement with Japan. It would like to have a similar trade engagement with Southeast Asia, with India, which is very different from the United States approach, of course, which has been trade war, tariffs, and pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. So it's not really sensible to talk about a Western policy towards China or Asia. Rhetorically, there may be similarities. That's fine. In reality, however, you and I both know very well that in Brussels, in Frankfurt, in London, in Paris, there's a very different conversation about being part of the some countries, the Belt and Road Initiative, joining the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, pursuing these free trade areas. And of course, geography would dictate that this be the case. And I think that's perfectly normal. that Europe have this posture that's quite different and quite frankly a lot more constructive than that of the United States.
Absolutely. Let me just turn now to our audience. If you have a question, a comment to make, please go on Twitter, #FOE debates, and my colleague Amanda will send me your question and I'll put it to Parag. So Parag, I remember now, I think it was a couple of months ago, maybe a year ago even, you were in Brussels talking about Eurasian connectivity. And I think the points you were making then are still very relevant, especially saying what you've just said, which I think is absolutely something I agree with. But often we're given a binary choice, and we find ourselves like Asians, like Southeast Asia and others, saying you're either with the United States or you're with China. And I think the challenge really for all of us is to have our own leadership identity and to work on our own constructive relationships with both. So this connectivity issue comes into it as well, because the BRI is seen as a very globally ambitious geopolitical move by China. And of course, America is telling many of us not to be part of it. Can I have your comments, please?
I've often found that it takes a non-European to continuously stoke Europe to be more confident, and it's a role that I've been playing since I moved to Germany when I was in high school. As a teenager, I've been very pro-European, sort of an American who's very pro-European, who happens to be Asian. So I'm trying to see everyone's side of the story, but most consistently, I think I've been pro-European. And one of the things that I've pointed out, as a matter of fact, is that in the past 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe has still undertaken the most transformative investments to its east, right? More transformative than Chinese investments to its west have been, so to speak, right? The enlargement of the European Union itself is the most fundamental evidence of that. So I always like to remind Europeans that they have the most successful track record of state transformation, modernization, democratization, and inclusion and embedding in institutions. That's not something that any Asian power has successfully managed to do yet. And it's not likely to happen given the fault lines and confrontations that exist within Asia. So that's one reason why Europeans should be very confident. Another is that, quite frankly, the European process tends to learn from crisis, right? It takes a crisis such as this for Europeans to come together and realize that monetary policy now has to be complemented with a common fiscal policy, that given the divergence in terms of strategic orientation with the United States that goes back 20 years, now Europe, of course, has to be much more self-reliant. And obviously things that happen along the way in the US, like the transition through these different administrations, and of course now the kind of pinnacle of unreliability being the Trump administration. Now Europe really cannot wait and see. So there are many reasons why, and I think also just generational change in consciousness, right? So I still have that optimism that Europe can align these stars, and now also again being tough, in the case of China with the reciprocal demands for market access and how Belt and Road is managed and pushing sustainability and ESG governance. We do look to Europe still globally for these regulatory roles that it plays. So again, it's not this false choice, choose between, first of all, as we know, it's not really a choice between China and the US. In global trade, Europe is more important than both, right? So it's really about having, I think that Europe's problems are largely, internal. I'll just make one last point. Again, from the American point of view, I've watched for many years that Europeans have complained America has been dividing us. Over new Europe versus old Europe with the Iraq War. The Russians are dividing us, right? Should Russia be allowed to invest in energy projects and utilities or not? Now the Chinese are dividing us over 16+1 in Belt and Road. At some point, given that Europe is, 600 million of the wealthiest people in the world, with such an incredible legacy, playing victim, 3 times in the last 20 years is not really the way to view it, right? It is Europe's own fault if it cannot manage these situations. So again, I view this as an internal issue much more than an external one.
Yes, thank you very much. I think you and me both are perhaps talking the same the same narrative, that Europe does have the ability, the capacity to be more self-confident internally and on the global stage. So perhaps you're right. It does take an Asian-born European in my case, and perhaps also Asian-born American in your case, to bring those points to the fore. So thank you very much for that. Parag, let's move now to your latest sort of work on mobility. And a very interesting article you wrote recently talked about how there would be certain changes in the way choices are made by people where they would live. And you said that this would be countries and cities that were considered good for your health, that health would be a dominant feature in this. Just explain a tiny little bit more.
Sure. I mean, it's so striking, Shada. December 2019, we were able to look back and say that 2019 was a high watermark. We had never had so many international tourists and business travelers in history as the year 2019. The stock of total international migrants was 275 million people, again, more than ever in history. And then came the pandemic. But clearly, migration has many, many drivers, from economic dislocation, technological automation, labor imbalances, political unrest and violence, and of course now, on top of all of those motivations, the people's desire to shift from red zones to green zones, right? From unhealthy to healthy places, or fleeing climate change, really, sort of, again, red zones to blue zones, you might say. Now, we have artificially suppressed international migration. At the moment, it is zero. But again, that will change because the same demographic imbalances persist, particularly in Europe, of course. And so what we will see is that perhaps, given the technologies that are now at play in terms of verifying people's travel history and health immunity and so forth, countries will find new ways to more efficiently determine which migrants they want to bring in and in which ways they need them and so forth. And you found, if you just take Brexit, Boris Johnson has turned around and said, is recognized the labor shortages that they have in the UK market and realized that they actually have to have a more Canadian style, more efficient, more points-based, sector-focused system that's depoliticized and focused on needs. All of those needs still exist. And now the demand to move is going to be greater than ever after this pandemic. So I'm trying to do a global study of the future of human geography. And I'll just point out that this is incredibly geopolitical. When you study geopolitics properly, you don't ignore demographics, right? And this goes back either millennia or certainly to the 19th century when geopolitics became a field. You have to think about demographics. In a world where the population is actually beginning to level off, Shada, I mean, the world population will probably never reach 9 billion people, which is much less than we thought the peak human population would be. I actually believe we will start to compete. Today, we talk about protectionism, nationalism, xenophobia, walls, and borders. I would say we're just months, years, not even, away from a world where we're competing for human beings, for labor, for talent, to augment our economies, because the pandemic has laid bare just how much our economies actually depend on human mobility, consumption, and social interaction.
Absolutely. It's interesting, this conversation, we had this with the European Commissioner for Home Affairs, Ylva Johansson, just a week ago, really. And she was pointing out something that we've all seen, how COVID-19 has spotlighted the role of essential workers who, are mostly of migrant backgrounds. And so the narrative here in Europe is suddenly changing in saying that, yes, we do need migrants. Of course, populists will always, not accept that. But I think it's up to our more reasonable, sensible politicians to make that point and to make that in a simple, understandable way. Final question to you, Parag, is actually about this idea now that we're decoupling. Globalization is endangered. Globalization is dead. We are all now nation states working, on our own national interests. So forget globalization. That's the past. Now we're going to be reshoring, bringing back our investments and bringing back jobs. Your comments?
I think, globalization is many different things. A lot of people who are cynical, negative, skeptical of globalization will pick one statistic and reify that and make that represent all of globalization. But that's not the way it works, right? There's the mobility of people, of capital, of trade, of goods, services, and so forth. And we have to take these things one by one. First of all, we have, in fact, an increase, of course, in services trade, right? The movement of knowledge, internet, data flows, and so forth. We've seen that increase in recent years, and certainly as a result of digitization with the pandemic, perhaps even more so. More efforts to lay down, high volume internet cables across and between the continents of the world. So that's more important in a way and more value added economically than some of the more traditional categories of globalization. There are certain categories of globalization that we should want actively to recede, and one obvious example is the oil trade. Does it really make sense that when you can have local, renewable, alternative energy sources, that you pump oil out of the ground and put it on tankers and ship it across the world and destroy our climate? Of course not. We should actively pursue deglobalization in some of these areas. And statistically, that may look like it's doing harm to globalization, but it's the greatest thing we could ever do. So it's not really a question of whether you are pro or against globalization. It's what is optimal. But now when it comes to the globalization that most people think of, which is the international trade in goods, let's remember that given this sort of tripolar world and the different regulatory zones and frameworks that are emerging, you cannot really sell or have dominant market share in some of the overseas geographies where a Western multinational, a European company, an American company that generates 30-40% of its revenue from Asia. How can it possibly maintain that market share unless it's making its cars, making its iPhones in Asian markets? And therefore, what you've found is that despite all the talk of deglobalization, executives in America and in Europe are saying, hold on, we may make back at home what we sell here within these borders, but we also have to make within other borders those things that we sell over there. And again, going back to the fundamental point, if Asia is the largest economic area in the world, has the fastest growing middle class, has the largest consumer base, you cannot avoid being Asian. You cannot avoid operating in Asia. So deglobalization is not really, it's not actually in the national interest anyway. Globalization would never have happened if it were not in the national interest. Now, there are some aspects where it's in the national interest to retrench. I have nothing against countries wanting to have some degree of a strategic industrial policy so that they can have redundancy, resilience in their production of essential items, whether they're industrial, medical, and so forth. That's perfectly logical. And optimal supply chain efficiency is not the way to run a fragile world. So I think that we will make these adjustments, we'll make these correctives, but there's very little evidence that we will sort of do away with these global dependencies that we have on reaching out to each other for technology and for market access and for talent.
Thank you very much, Parag. Thank you also for bringing in the question of how we're going to be racing and competing with each other to find the best talents in the world. Parag, thank you very much indeed for a very, very, I would say, informative, but also historically and geographically pointedly important to tell us where we are today in terms of China, Asia, Europe. And you've said some brilliant, I would say, inconvenient truths, which we need to really hammer home so that we can understand that this world is not necessarily heading for another Cold War or a tech war, but that we can, when we find it in ourselves, to work with each other, especially as we work towards a recovery. Parag, I will now let you go. And I'll say again, thank you very much for joining us in this strategic conversation. Friends, the conversation continues with our online discussion with 7 brilliant panelists on many of the issues that Parag has brought to the fore and that we will discuss in further detail: EU-China, EU-Japan, EU-India, ASEM, the Asia-Europe meetings, and a number of other issues. So thank you very much. Join us in about 5 minutes. Take care, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you, Parag.